Good afternoon, everyone. I'm really excited to be here presenting on homegrown tomato troubleshooting. My name is Faye Kuosman, and I'm the Extension Agent for Horticulture in Woodford County. And first, I'm just going to go through some site requirements, although most of you, I'm sure by now, have your tomatoes in the ground. But just as a consideration, if you're new to this, making sure that you're in a full sun location, in well-drained soil, and that your soil pH is somewhere between 6.2 to 6.8. It's always very helpful to get a soil sample through your county extension office to make sure you're in that range. And then trying to rotate crops is also very important. So you're not having those same disease and insect pressures every year. So just some general pest control practices that are important when you are considering growing tomatoes so that you don't have as much disease and insect pressure. Sanitation is really important, and that is making sure that you get plants that are infected. If they're all the way infected and you just need to get them out of there, that's important so they don't spread. And then also over the winter, instead of just leaving debris in the garden, making sure you pull all of that out. Making sure that you're spacing the plants appropriately, and then rotating crops, as I already mentioned, as well as mulching and watering, which we'll discuss, and just minimizing any kind of plant stress. And then very importantly is just regular scouting, trying to go in your garden regularly and watching for different things going on so that you can see changes day to day, because some of these diseases can happen pretty quickly. So here is just some information on spacing, which once again, I'm sure you have your plants in the ground, but this is just for future reference. So if you're just staking your plants, you want to have about 2 feet apart. And if you have caged plants, you want them more like 2.5 to 3 foot apart. So here is a short video that I wanted to have you watch just to break this up a little bit and make it a little more fun. So this is me in my garden, just talking about a few things. So let's hope this works on sound. Okay, so I just wanted to show you the tomatoes that I have in my garden. I have them in raised beds, and here's the straw that I've talked about using as a mulch. I need to put it down a little bit thicker, but this will help with the soil splashing up onto the plant, which can then cause some of the diseases that we'll discuss. So it'll help with keeping in moisture, keeping down the weeds, but also helping with that splashing. So on these tomatoes here, you can see a few leaves that start to have, this looks like it could be the start of some Septoria leaf spot. So what I like to do, it always starts on the bottom leaf. So sometimes what I'll do, these are some nice little clippers that you can use for harvesting, but also for cutting off leaves. Because if you pull leaves, sometimes they'll rip and then they'll damage the stem. So you can see how this stem's a little bit damaged from this wire here. So just trying to keep things like that at a minimal so that you don't get other disease coming in. But so I'm clipping off these bottom leaves. And then you want to throw those out because that will spread to other plants. And then the other thing is some people will, especially if your tomatoes are not in cages, but they're just staked. So since they can get so big, it's hard for the stake to hold them all. So some people will prune. And so the pruning would be, see where this little leaf, new leaf is coming out right in the crotch right there. So you just actually pluck that right off. Oh, see, that's what I mean by the ripping. And that's why I should have used my clippers right here. Sometimes they'll pluck right off, but sometimes they rip like that. And here's another example of one that I'll prune right there. And these are getting pretty big. So I'll just do a little bit of that as the leaves are growing in the middle. And then the other thing is the spacing. As you can see here, these are spaced about 2.5 feet apart. You want to go at least 2 feet, but you can already see with this size, they're going to get all the way up to here. And you can see how they start to crowd each other out. And then you get more disease because you don't have good airflow through here. So these are actually just a welded wire, concrete wire that I bought at our local feed store. And so I bought a big giant roll of it and just cut them into these wire cages.
because a lot of times the cages that you can buy, I don't have an example here, but some of just your small little cages that have 3 or 4 stakes that go in and then they kind of get bigger as they come up, those don't hold up as good, so they always fall over on me. So I went with the big, nice cages like this. So that is it.
Okay, so that was kind of just showing. I like to show hands-on as much as possible. So through these Zoom meetings, it's a little more difficult than meeting in person. So hopefully you were able to see that and get the sound okay. But that shows you with talking about mulch. So straw is a really good mulch. And I have some straw down there to help from that water splashing up onto the plants. And so another thing to consider when you are purchasing plants, although most of you have them in the ground, once again, this is for future reference, look for disease resistance as much as you can. So things like V, F, and N stand for some issues that tomatoes will get. And so you want to find that disease resistance. And it'll usually say on the plant that you're buying, as you can see underlined here, Verticillium wilt, Fusarium wilt, and nematode resistant. So that helps just to minimize any kind of disease that you might be getting. So in the video, you can see here are my tomato plants, and I've put them in this concrete wire, support wire, I think they call it, but you can buy it in any sized roll that you want, and then you just cut it into the cages. And that works really well because a lot of times, which I was referring to in the video, on the right-hand side there, some of these cages just don't provide the best support. I've used the cage on the right-hand side for many years, but with these indeterminate tomatoes that get so big, they tend to fall over. And so that can be really frustrating. So you just want a really good, secure, and strong cage. So the other option is to stake the plants. And as you can see here, people will use tobacco sticks, different methods. There's the Florida weave, which is where you put a stake on each end of the row, and then you run strings across and tie the tomato plants up as they grow. But basically with any of these, the cage, the stakes, you want to keep, the goal is to keep the plants off the ground so that you're minimizing that disease. And of course with these, you're going to be putting them up on twine to hold them up, otherwise they'll just fall over. And then suckering or pruning, which I demonstrated in that video, is very important with the stakes, because otherwise you're going to get too many stems growing and you won't be able to keep them up on that stake. And the whole goal of staking is so that you can get more plants in an area, so you can put them closer together. But if you let multiple stems grow and you don't do that pruning, then you're going to have issues with crowding and disease, and you won't get that good airflow. So you definitely want to be considering pruning if you're going to be staking, and there's a lot of good information on pruning. You can just contact your local extension agent for more information if you're interested. So as far as fertilizing, the recommendation is to fertilize when the first fruits are golf ball size, and then you want to repeat 2 weeks after that, and then again a month later. And so there's several different options. You may already have fertilizers at home that you're using now, and you can follow the directions on that. But a big thing we see with our soil samples here in Woodford County, at least I know in central Kentucky, is we have really high levels of phosphorus and potassium. So generally we don't need anything except nitrogen for the plant. So things like 10-10-10 that contain nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium are just not necessary, and can even cause problems in the plants when you have those high levels of nutrients. You can get ripening issues and various different problems there. So you want to look for a fertilizer that contains only nitrogen, unless you've done a soil test and you know that you need phosphorus and potassium as well. But once again, that's always why we recommend doing a soil test. So some things like ammonium sulfate, you can see the first number there, 21 pound, that has 21 pounds of nitrogen in it. And so you want to look at that first number. Urea or blood meal, these are just some examples. And then they always say it in, usually it'll say per 100-foot row. So like, for example, with the blood meal, 3 pounds per 100-foot row. So to break that down per plant, since most of us have small gardens, so say your tomatoes are 2 feet apart, that would be 50 plants in a 100-foot row. So if they're recommending 3 pounds of blood meal per 100-foot row, you do 3 divided by 50, those 50 plants, which is 0.06 pounds. Well, say you have your fertilizer, well, what's 0.06 pounds? That's hard to figure out to measure. So you multiply that by 16 to get your measurement into ounces, since there's 16 ounces in a pound, and then that gives you 0.96 ounces of blood meal per plant. And so if you have a scale, you can purchase a really cheap, even kitchen scale, and that's really helpful for measuring out these granular fertilizers that you're going to be using for side dressing. Because any liquid fertilizers, you can use tablespoons, but with the granular, it's always going to be in ounces or pounds. So it really helps to have just a real simple scale. You can measure that out and make sure that you get your fertilizer right, just to help with making sure you're fertilizing properly and not over fertilizing and causing issues. So with watering, with most all vegetables, you want about 1 inch to 1.5 inches of water per week. You don't want to use overhead sprinklers, so that can cause more disease issues. So either a drip line or just watering on the plant. As you can see, this watering can is going straight to the roots. You want to make sure that you're not overhead watering and causing more disease pressure. And then with mulching, this is a picture that you saw from the video of the straw that I have around my tomatoes. So some people will put down newspaper or cardboard and then put straw on top of that. But mulching helps prevent weeds. It helps with that splashing of the soil to prevent some of those disease problems. It also helps keep moisture in the soil so that you're not having extremes of dry and wet. It helps moderate the soil temperature so it doesn't get as hot. It stays a little bit cooler in the summer. And then, as I mentioned, aids in that disease control. And then another thing to consider is just keeping those weeds down. So as soon as you start getting small weeds germinating, I like to use a shuffle hoe, it's called, or a stirrup hoe, some people call it, and just go through there and rip those small ones out right away, because weeds can harbor disease and insects. And so you just want to keep them away as much as possible. So now we're going to go into some various things, some environmental and physiological issues with tomatoes, some disease, and then some insects. And I will try to keep this on time. I know we started just a little bit late, but I'm gonna keep it to a minimal time here. So some issues we've actually seen lately, and this is in my garden here. These two pictures you can see where the leaves are curling on my tomato, but I showed a picture on that top right is actually one tomato on the left that doesn't have the curling, and the tomato on the right does. So some plants won't get it. Some varieties are just more susceptible to it, but basically there's nothing you can do about it. It's just when we get a lot of changes in weather, from cool to moist or hot and dry. It can be from excessive moisture or excessive nitrogen. There can be several things that cause it, but right now, from what we're seeing, it looks like it's just from some excessive moisture, because normally you'll see the leaves start at the bottom and they'll curl upwards, which is what you're seeing in my tomatoes here. But it should go away fairly quickly. And like I said, I only have one plant that's actually doing that. So if you see that, don't be alarmed. But now, something that looks similar to the leaf curling but is different is 2,4-D herbicide injury, and this could also be Roundup can cause this as well. But tomatoes are very susceptible to 2,4-D. So if you're spraying any kind of herbicides, or you have a lawn company coming in and spraying, you want to make sure it's not a windy day, because any kind of drift, and it can travel from a pretty good distance, any kind of drift of that can get on the leaves and cause this curling. And the leaves will look really deformed. So it's different than the leaf curling in that you can see in this picture here, the leaves just look really deformed. And of course you want to check with your county extension agent to be sure. But a little bit of damage the plant should be able to overcome, but you just might have more poor production. And so you just want to be really careful with that. One lesson learned that I knew, but I had to teach my husband, is that you never mix herbicides with fungicides or insecticides, because a few years ago he had washed the tank out, but I didn't know that he was putting some herbicide, had put herbicide in his tank that we were then using to spray some copper fungicide for some disease issues we were having. And he said, well, I washed the tank out really good, but that's just not good enough. You always want to separate them. So he sprayed it. The tank had Roundup in it, I believe before that, and the plants were just completely ruined from that. So make sure you separate tanks. Okay, so some other environmental stress, blossom end rot. I'm sure that you have experienced this if you've grown tomatoes. So calcium, it's a calcium deficiency, but calcium enters the plant through the flow of water, so watering the plant. So most soils in Kentucky have a lot of calcium in them. I know that soil tests that come through here, we always have high calcium levels. So it's not an issue of that the soil doesn't have it in it. It's just that the water is not transporting the calcium up into the fruit of the plant. So it can be due to all of these things you see on here. But the main thing is just consistent watering is usually what we see is that you're letting the plants dry out too much in between watering, or and it's just not consistent. So you want to consistently water, and drip irrigation is a good way to do that so that you can set it on a timer and know that you're watering regularly. It can also be due to not enough roots taking up the calcium. So if root growth is really slow, which could be caused from really wet or really dry soils. So once again, those two extreme moistures. High humidity also slows water movement, which of course slows the calcium into the fruit. It's usually worse earlier in the season when the plants are growing fast and stressed for water. So just remember not to cultivate weeds too close to the plant and cut those roots because they can be kind of high on the soil. So when you're weeding around the plants, just be careful not to weed too close to the plant. Maintain that soil moisture consistently, especially when we get into these high temperatures. And then once again, that drip irrigation is a good way to do that. So fruit cracking, I just saw some of this. I don't have a lot of tomatoes ripe yet, but I do have a few cherry tomatoes that are just ripening, and I've had some cracking on those tomatoes. It generally occurs when we have a lot of rain and then we go into dry weather. I do have drip irrigation, but just the hot, humid weather will cause it as well. And so it's basically the fruit is expanding quicker than the tomato skin can grow, and so you'll get that cracking. So you just want to harvest those immediately before they begin to rot. You can finish ripening them indoors. There's some varieties you'll see, it'll say crack resistant, and usually that's, they are more crack resistant. I know with mine, I was growing an orange Peruche cherry tomato. I love that variety, by the way. It's really good, orange Peruche. And that's the one that was cracking, but it didn't say it was crack resistant. So the other ones I know that I planted that are crack resistant, I haven't been able to see yet if that's really the case. But there's not a whole lot you can do with that. It's just the extreme weather conditions that cause it, and fluctuations of the temperature. Sun scald. So especially if you're staking your tomatoes and you're pruning them, sometimes you're cutting a lot of those leaves that are covering and helping protect the fruit from the sun. So it'll scald them, but they'll kind of dry up and blister, and it looks similar to blossom end rot, but it won't be on that blossom end of the tomato. It'll be on the side like you see here. So just try not to over prune, and then sometimes later in the season when you get a lot of disease, you're losing foliage from those disease where it's dropping off, so you'll get more sun hitting the plants. I know that later in the season, if I get early blight and a lot of leaves are coming off because they've dried up and died, the sun's hitting the fruit more, and so it'll get more sun scald. So just trying to make sure you keep the disease at a minimal and keep good coverage of the foliage. Tomato yellow shoulder disorder. That's something you'll see the green around the top, like you see in the picture. That's caused by adverse weather conditions, whether it gets really cool in the fall when you're still getting tomatoes in, or really when it warms up really suddenly, you get really hot temperatures. Both of those extremes can happen. Of course, you can't control adverse weather conditions, but another thing that causes it is just soils that aren't as conducive to growing tomatoes. So once again, doing that soil test, because low potassium levels, low organic matter, or a high pH can cause those issues. So another environmental stress can be poor fruit set. And this can be caused once again by temperature extremes, usually when it gets really hot. So above 90 degrees, tomatoes just won't produce as well. So when you get up above 95 degrees, sometimes you'll get, or if it's really dry and you're not watering properly, you'll see the drying out of the bloom, similar to in this picture. So the dry soil, and then if you have too much shade, so you want at least 8 hours of sun, and then sometimes it can be caused by excessive nitrogen application. So you just want to go by those recommendations of fertilizing. So those are the environmental disorders. And now we're going to go into actual diseases of tomatoes. So a very common one that I'm sure if you've grown tomatoes that you've had is early blight. And this is where the leaves, it starts at the bottom, and the leaves will turn brown. They'll have brown spots with concentric rings on them. Now, you can always confirm this with your county extension agent, but like I said, it begins in the lower foliage and moves up, and it's favored by wet, warm weather, which we have coming into right basically when you're planting the tomatoes into early June. That weather is favored by this, and then you start having defoliating leaves and poor fruit set, and then you get those sun-scalded fruit like we just talked about. So in order to control that, you want to maintain that proper fertility. So make sure you're fertilizing your plants properly, not under fertilizing, not over fertilizing. You want to cage or stake your plants, which we already talked about. The mulching will help because it'll help. It comes from the soil. So if you minimize that soil splashing up onto the plant, that mulch will protect that and not allow that splashing. So mulching, and then rotating your crops, because if you put them in the same place each year, you continue to get those same diseases. Some of you won't be able to rotate, but so you just do what you can. So you want to spray the foliage at the first signs of that disease, because I have one more little short video that talks about some of that, but it's not going to cure. Once it's there, any sprays are not going to cure the disease. They're just going to prevent it from spreading onto the rest of the plant. So here are some lists of different sprays, of different fungicides you can use to control it from spreading. And then you'll need to spray weekly, every 7 to 10 days. If it's raining, you'll need to spray more because it'll wash it off. And some people will make a second planting of tomatoes in midsummer, which a lot of places you buy the tomatoes don't necessarily have them there then. But that would be like now would be the latest you would want to plant for your midsummer planting. And the reason for that is because you don't have as much disease pressure into the summer when it's more hot and dry. We're not getting all those rains, which really cause this problem. And then you can buy some resistant varieties. There are some resistant varieties coming out to early blight. Some of those are Mountain Fresh Plus, Juliet, Tommy Toe, and Old Brooks, and one more is Cabernet. So if you're interested in those, you can, that might be an option for future if you're having a lot of problems with this, or if you can't rotate out your plants. Septoria leaf spot, and I'm getting some of this on my plants right now. So I've been spraying some preventative fungicides so that it doesn't spread, and cutting those bottom leaves off. One thing I didn't mention after that video where I was cutting them with those clippers, it's really important to sanitize those clippers if you're going to different plants and cutting, because you're going to spread that. And so you want to sanitize those clippers. You can just get a little bottle of, put in a spray bottle some rubbing alcohol, that's 70% rubbing alcohol, and spray that in your clippers in between plants. Or since we all have hand sanitizer now, more of the liquid hand sanitizer, that works well. That works well too. So you can just put it in a spray bottle and spray those clippers in between. So once again, same as early blight, same things, preventative fungicides, and all the other things that I mentioned, caging, staking, and mulching. Late blight, we don't see this as much, but it happens later in the year. The fruit will start to turn brown, and then you'll see blemishes on the stem. As you can see in the picture here, there's some blemishes on the stems, and then it's found in cool, wet weather. So if we had a spring where you put them out early, you might get it, or usually later in the fall. If we're getting more rains in the fall, you would see it then. But then you'll see dead areas on the leaf with mold on the undersides. You want to maintain, once again, proper fertility. There's some sprays there that I listed that are the same as with the early blight and Septoria. apply those fungicides weekly, and then try to use disease-free transplants that don't already have issues, and so you're bringing in a stressed plant. And then controlling late blight in potatoes, because since they're in the same family, it can carry over to the tomatoes. So once again, with these, I haven't seen late blight much on any samples here. So you always want to confirm that with your extension agent, just to be sure you're controlling the right thing. And then Fusarium and Verticillium wilt, another thing that can happen. The leaves will wilt and turn yellow and fall. And then it's usually on one side of the plant, and then it'll go to the other side. And Verticillium wilt is when it's cool weather, and Fusarium wilt is when it's warm. So we're more likely to see the Fusarium wilt. And then that's where you really want to look for those resistant varieties, because most out there have resistance to Fusarium and Verticillium, and that's the V and the F that you'll see. So you want to use crop rotation to help with it as well. And then viruses, those can be tricky. So it can look like symptoms of other things. You get distorted leaves, mottled leaves, discolored fruit, stunning or strange growth. And so you want to make sure that you remove the infected plants and then prevent that from happening, pull that plant out. So I'm getting low on time here, but I'm going to go through a video and a few insects, and then we'll wrap it up.
So I just wanted to quickly show you, today I'm using a copper fungicide because I'm getting some early symptoms of Septoria leaf spot. And that's the little spotting here that you want to catch very early on. It starts lower on the plant as well as early blight, but the Septoria has smaller spots like this. So you want to catch it. This spray is not going to cure it. It's just a preventative. So what I want to do is cover the whole plant so the rest of the plant doesn't get it. What it's already affected, you can't cure at this point. So I'm going to cut those bottom leaves off. And then I'm going to spray the rest of the plant to cover it. So this is the copper fungicide. It does have a funny blue color. And I'm following the directions on the label, which say 0.5 to 2 fluid ounces per gallon. So there's 2 tablespoons in 1 fluid ounce. And so I've mixed it according to the directions on the label, and you can see it's blue. I've got 1 gallon. This is a nice little small sprayer that you can spray for just your home garden. And you want to get just the end so you get a good fan, but you want to cover the entire plant. And I'm gonna walk around and make sure I cover it all. And it says spray every 7 to 10 days, but that's not taken into account if it rains. So if it rains, it's gonna wash it off, so you're gonna have to respray it again. You wanna get that good coverage on early on in the season where we're getting a lot of rain. When it's dry, it's not so much an issue, but when it's raining, you're really gonna get more of this disease. So start it early. As soon as you're seeing those spots, get really good coverage on the whole plant. Simple enough to cover it. And that's all you got to do. And then I quickly wanted to point out a drip irrigation system. This is a real easy drip. There's the hole right there. They're every few inches, and they drip out directly onto the plant roots, because if you overhead water, you're going to cause a lot of more disease issues. So do not overhead water. You want to have either drip, or if you're just going to hand water, make sure you're directly putting it on the roots of the plant.
Okay, so hopefully you heard that okay. Now I'm just going to briefly go into some insects, and then we'll wrap it up. So a really common one that we'll see in really hot, dry weather in the summer are spider mites, and you'll see the stifling of the leaf. A horticultural oil or insecticidal soap would be the best to use that. Some people will use a heavy stream of water to just wash them off, but those soaps and oils work pretty well, and you just want to catch them early because they can spread very rapidly. So once again, using that scouting, just going out and knowing what's going on in your garden, so you catch things in time and not once it's too late, because most all of these things are going to be, especially with disease, are going to be preventative. They're not going to cure the problem. And especially with insects, they can multiply so quickly. You really want to stay on top of it. So catching those, just going through and looking. And so with aphids, I had a lot of aphids early on. I actually brought in some plants that had them not paying attention. And so then they rapidly spread to the other plants. And it's more of a problem early on. So I sprayed with some insecticidal soap and some neem, some different things I have listed there, and I was able to get rid of them after 2 or 3 sprays, and I haven't had the problem since. So they're usually earlier on in the season, but you can see the picture there. They'll be all over the plant. And then flea beetles, you'll see these, especially they like leafy greens and potatoes and tomatoes, all kinds of things. And they're tiny little black bugs. You see a lot of holes. And then I have some controls there that you can refer to in the PowerPoint. And then blister beetles, that's another one. They can be very destructive. They chew holes in the leaf. I haven't had this issue myself, but I've seen it and had samples brought in of the damage. So just hand picking, but you want to be careful because with some people they give a really bad rash. So you want to use gloves. And then there's some other options for sprays there. Tomato hornworm, you all have probably seen these before. They're really big, so it's easy enough to just pull them off and crush them. Or you can use BT, Bacillus thuringiensis, and that's a natural product that's great for caterpillars because it's very specific to caterpillars, so you're not killing any beneficial insects. So you can pull those off, and then in that top picture there, if you've ever seen this, little white eggs, that is actually from a beneficial wasp that has laid its eggs, and then basically as they hatch, they will eat the caterpillar and desiccate it, and it will die. So pretty cool, and you can hatch them out, and then you'll have those beneficial wasps in your garden. So leave the ones that have the little white eggs. Stink bugs can cause significant damage. You'll see in the fruit there the symptoms of that. They suck the juice out and cause those white spots, and so I have some recommendations on sprays for them if they are an issue in your garden. Cutworms, they're more early on in the season. You can use collars on your plants. The later season cutworms eat the leaves. And so once again, you can use that BT to kill those. And then root knot nematodes are in the root of the plant, but they'll cause this yellowing and dieback of plants. So you want to try to use resistant varieties, which a lot are. They'll have the N noted on there so that they're resistant to the nematodes. So here are several resources that are great. We have a lot of resources on our UK. And so if you don't have the Home Vegetable Gardening in Kentucky guidebook, you definitely want that. You can pick it up at your local county extension office. There's a Solanaceous IPM guide to tomatoes. There's an IPM scouting guide, so you know your natural enemies. So you keep those around. And then a newer one is Sustainable Management of Solanaceous Crops. And so all of those resources are there in the links so that you can find those. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to contact me or your local county extension office.